Greetings, humans of the internet. Welcome once again to Bowtie Talks. I, of course, am your excellent host, Luke Johnson, coming to you as usual from my undisclosed location in Midwest USA with some more historical insights. And since last week's episode was about the history of flight, I thought a good parallel to this would be the history of space travel. And since I have now tackled the stratosphere, I figured it would be a good time to go even further. So count down from 10 and say blast off as we launch ourselves into the history of American space travel. Now, in the latter half of the 20th century, rockets had been developed that were powerful enough to overcome the force of gravity to reach orbital velocities. And in the 1930s and 40s, Germany saw the possibilities of using long-distance rockets as weapons. In the later days of World War II, London was attacked by 200-mile range V-2 missiles, which arched 60 miles high over the English Channel at more than 3,500 miles an hour. And after World War II ended, the United States and the Soviet Union created their own missile programs. And how the United States got the men to create the missile program and would later help create NASA, well, that's quite a story in and of itself. You see, when World War II was entering its final stages, American and British organizations teamed up to scour occupied Germany for as much military, scientific, and technological development research as possible. And organizations like the Combined Intelligence Objectives Subcommittee, CIOS for short, began confiscating war-related documents and materials and interrogating scientists as German research facilities were seized by the Allied forces. And interestingly, one enlightening discovery was recovered from a toilet at Bonn University, and it was the Ausenberg list, which was a catalog of scientists and engineers that had been put to work for the Third Reich. And so, in a covert operation originally called Operation Overcast, but later renamed Operation Paperclip, roughly 1,600 of these German scientists, along with their families, were brought to the United States to work on America's behalf during the Cold War. And the program was won by the newly formed Joint Intelligence Operatives Agency, JIOA for short, whose goal was to harness German intellectual resources to help develop America's arsenal of rockets and other biological and chemical weapons, and to ensure such coveted information did not fall into the hands of the Soviet Union. You gotta be sure the Russians don't see any of this. And although he originally sanctioned the operation, President Harry Truman forbade the agency from recruiting any Nazi members or active Nazi supporters. However, officials within the JIOA and Office of Strategic Services, the forerunner to the CIA, bypassed this directive by eliminating or whitewashing incriminating evidence of possible war crimes from the scientists' records, believing their intelligence to be crucial to the country's post-war efforts. And perhaps one of the most famous of these scientists was Wernher von Braun, a technical director at the Army Research Center in Germany, who was instrumental in developing the V-2 rocket that devastated England during the war. Von Braun and other rocket scientists were brought to Fort Bliss, Texas, and White Sands Proving Grounds, New Mexico, as War Department special employees to assist the U.S. Army with rocket experimentation. Von Braun later became the director of NASA's Marshall Air Flight Center and the chief architect of the Saturn V launch vehicle, which eventually propelled 24 American astronauts to the moon. And of course, during all this, the Cold War was happening. And this, of course, gave birth to the space race. The United States and the former Soviet Union were battling each other as to who would get to space first. And in 1957, October the 4th to be specific, the first human to go into space was cosmonaut Lieutenant Yuri Gagarin, who was launched again by the Soviet Union for a one-orbit journey around the Earth. His flight lasted 108 minutes and reached an altitude of about 202 miles. And just 3 months later, on January the 31st, 1958, the first U.S. satellite, Explorer 1, went into orbit. As there's one thing that's history shown about us Americans, it's that we are not one to be outdone. And in 1961, the U.S. launched Project Mercury, the first U.S. program to put humans into space. The first of which happened in 1961 when astronaut Alan Shepard became the first American to fly into space. Project Mercury made 25 flights, 6 of which carried astronauts between 1961 and 1963. The objectives of this program were to orbit a human spacecraft around Earth to investigate a person's ability to function in space and to recover both the astronaut and spacecraft safely. And more than 2 million people from government agencies and the aerospace industry combined their skills, initiative, and experience to make the project possible. Mercury showed that humans could function for periods of up to 34 hours of weightless flight. And of course, this was very much a collaborative effort. And one of the more interesting people who helped Alan Shepard get to space was Katherine Johnson, a NASA research mathematician who did the trajectory analysis for Alan Shepard's historic mission. She worked at NASA's Langley Research Center from 1953 to 1986, and she and many other women made critical technical contributions to the space program, and I salute her. Project Mercury later gave way for the Gemini program, which primarily tested equipment and mission procedures and trained astronauts and ground crews for the future Apollo missions to the moon. The program's main goals were to test an astronaut's ability to fly long-duration flights, meaning 2 weeks, to understand how a spacecraft could rendezvous and dock with another vehicle in Earth's orbit, to perfect re-entry landing methods, and to further understand the effects of longer space flights on astronauts. NASA selected Gemini because the word is Latin for twins, and the Gemini was a capsule built for two. And on the Gemini 4 spacewalk on June 3rd, 1965, an astronaut Actually, I think astronauts for work for NASA should be called nastronauts. Just makes sense. But anyway, astronaut Ed White became the first American to walk in space. And now that a man had walked in space, the logical next step was to put a man on the moon. And as John F. Kennedy said, landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth within a decade was a national goal set by President John F. Kennedy in 1961. And exactly 8 years, 1 month, and 26 days after President Kennedy challenged Americans to reach for the moon, Project Apollo landed the first humans on the lunar surface and returned them safely to Earth. The Apollo program also developed technology to meet other national interests in space, conducted scientific exploration of the moon, and developed humanity's capability to work in the lunar environment. The Apollo program, however, did not have an easy early beginning. It was hit by tragedy as the first crew prepared to fly. On January 27, 1967, fire swept through the Apollo 1 command module during a pre-flight test at the Cape Kennedy launch pad. Astronauts Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee lost their lives. NASA was not deterred, however, and they changed how things were done to ensure the safety and success of future missions. However, their hard work and determination worked out because on July 20th, 1969, Apollo 11 Commander Neil Armstrong placed the first human footstep on the moon. And he said the now iconic phrase, "This is one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind." And yes, he actually said a man, not man. Man and mankind in that context are synonyms, and if you say this is one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind, it sounds redundant. A total of 12 Americans on 6 separate Apollo missions set foot on the moon between July 1969 and December 1972. And since then, no humans have ever left Earth's orbit. But more than 500 men and women have spent as many as 438 consecutive days in space. And starting in the early 1970s, a series of Russian space stations, the U.S. Skylab station, and numerous space shuttle flights have provided Earth orbiting bases for varying periods of human occupancy and activity. And this now gives us a time to discuss foreign relations. In the 1970s, U.S.-Soviet political tensions that had accelerated the space race began to thaw, and competition gave way to cooperation between the two nations with the Apollo-Soyuz test project. International collaboration among many nations would become the norm during the space shuttle era and current cooperation in human spaceflight with the International Space Station. These partnerships have taught us more about the universe, improved our lives at home, and expanded the possibilities for the future exploration into deep space. And the 1980s saw continued use of the satellite. In the 1980s, the satellite communications expanded to carry television programs, and people were able to pick up the satellite signals on their home dish antennas. Satellites discovered an ozone hole over the Antarctic and pinpointed forest fires and gave us photographs of the nuclear power plant disaster in Chernobyl in 1986. Astronomical satellites found new stars and gave us a new view of the center of our galaxy. And this gave way, of course, to the Space Shuttle. In April 1981, the launch of the Space Shuttle Columbia ushered in a period of reliance on the reusable shuttle for most civilian and military space missions. 24 successful shuttle launches fulfilled many scientific and military requirements until January 28, 1986, when just 73 seconds after liftoff, the Space Shuttle Challenger exploded. The crew of 7 was killed, including Krista McAuliffe, a teacher from New Hampshire who would have been the first civilian in space. Sad, isn't it? And the Gulf War proved the value of satellites in modern conflicts. During the war, Allied forces were able to use their control of the high ground of space to achieve a decisive advantage. Satellites were used to provide information on enemy troop formations and movements, early warning of enemy missile attacks, and precise navigation in the featureless desert terrain. The advantages of satellites allowed the coalition forces to quickly bring the war to a conclusion, saving many lives. And the dawn of the 21st century saw another improvement in space travel, and that, of course, is the International Space Station. Now, to anyone who's not sure what it is a research laboratory in low Earth orbit. With many different partners contributing on its design and contribution, the high-flying laboratory has become a symbol of cooperation in space exploration, with former competitors now working together. The station has been continuously occupied since the arrival of Expedition 1 in November of 2000. The station is served by a variety of visiting spacecraft. The Russian Soyuz in progress, the American Dragon and Cygnus, I'm guessing I'm pronouncing that right, the Japanese H-11 transfer vehicle, and formerly the Space Shuttle and the European Automated Transfer Vehicle. It has been visited by astronauts, cosmonauts, and space tourists from 17 different nations. If I ever get the money, I hope to see it. And I hope you've enjoyed our trek through American aerospace history. And who knows, maybe someday we'll even have civilian homes in space. Hey, a man can dream, can't he? I mean, I don't really think that's a good idea, come to think of it. I need gravity. I could imagine going mad in space. It'd be quite easy, actually, now that I think about it. We've learned that just because you have gotten it wrong the first time does not mean you are doomed to failure. So thank you for a little trek through history. Goodbye, and God bless.